In the autumn of 1887, the first hard wind came down out of the Wind River country, a full month before anyone in Larkspur expected it. But the talk along the boardwalk that week had nothing to do with the weather. It had to do with the young widow on the north edge of town who was building, by every account that reached the general store, a house inside of a house. Della Hartwell stood at the center of a half-finished cabin with her sleeves pushed past her elbows and a wooden scoop in her hand, and what she was doing made grown men stop their wagons in the road. She had framed her outer walls the ordinary way, stout and square. Then, a full hand's width inside those walls, she had raised a second set of walls, and into the narrow channel between the two, she was pouring sawdust. Loose, pale, dry sawdust, shovel after shovel of it, the kind that piled in drifts behind the sawmill and was good for nothing but soaking up spills and starting fires. She tamped it down with a length of broom handle, filled the gap higher, and tamped it again, as calm as a woman putting up preserves. A crowd gathered the way crowds do, drawn by the smell of someone else's foolishness. They watched her bury her own walls in mill waste, and they began, quietly at first and then not quietly at all, to laugh. Hollis Webb did not laugh. Hollis had built more than half the cabins in Larkspur with his own 2 hands, and he climbed down off his buckboard and walked to the doorway and looked at the sawdust pouring into the wall like a man looking at a wound. He was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his voice carried clear across the lot. "That's not a wall, Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "That's a haystack with a stovepipe through the middle of it." He let that settle. "You're packing kindling around your own fire and calling it sense. First spark that jumps a seam, the whole thing goes up like a torch, and you and that child with it." The laughter came harder then, because the most respected builder in the territory had said out loud what everyone was thinking. Della did not flinch. She did not set down her scoop and argue, and she did not color at the cruelty of it. She finished the channel she was filling, leveled the sawdust with the flat of her hand, reached for the next board, and fitted into place over the cavity so the pale waste vanished behind clean pine. To the men in the road, it looked like stubbornness. To Della, it was nothing of the kind. It was the only thing standing between her daughter and a second winter like the last one. She had buried a great deal in the last one. Her thoughts went where they always went when the laughter started, back to the long February nights in the thin-walled cabin she and Samuel had built their first year. When the wind off the flats found every crack in the green lumber and walked through the house as if no walls stood there at all. She remembered Sadie's cough, the wet, tearing sound of it coming out of the dark, a 5-year-old's whole small body shaking with it, while Della held her against the one warm spot near the stove and watched her own breath hang white in the room she could not keep warm. She remembered feeding the stove until her arms ached, and the woodpile shrank, and the corners of the cabin stayed rimed with frost, no matter how the fire roared. And she remembered Samuel going out into the worst of it after a strayed milk cow, certain he would be back by dark, and the 3 days of searching, and what they brought home on the 4th. The cold had not killed Samuel with malice. It had simply done what cold does to a man caught in the open with no shelter that held. And somewhere, in the grief of that spring, while the snow finally let go of the hollows, a question had taken root in Della that would not leave her. They had burned a mountain of wood that winter, and frozen anyway. The problem, she came to think, had never been that they lacked heat. They had made plenty of heat. The trouble was that the heat would not stay. It poured out through the boards as fast as the fire could make it, into a sky that did not need it, and left her family shivering beside a stove that was doing everything right. She had grown up around the answer without knowing it was an answer. Her father, Anders, an iceman who had cut and stored lake ice through 3 Wisconsin winters and sold it deep into July, had taught her the whole secret of his trade when she was a girl too small to lift the tongs. "You did not keep ice cold," he told her, "by fighting the summer. You could not fight the summer. You kept ice cold by wrapping it so completely in sawdust that the heat of July simply could not reach it. Block after block, packed in waste from the planing mill, would sit untouched through the dog days while the world outside baked. The trapped air in all that loose dust," he said, "was the finest blanket God ever made for nothing. Heat hated to cross it." It was Sadie's cough, in the end, that turned the memory into a plan. Lying awake one night that summer with the child breathing rough beside her, Della had thought about her father's ice, surviving July under a foot of mill dust. and she had turned the whole thing around in her mind until it sat the other way up. If sawdust could keep summer's heat out of a block of ice for 3 months, then sawdust could keep a winter's cold out of a house. More than that, the very same blanket that held the heat away from the ice would hold a stove's warmth inside a home. It was the same wall, working in both directions. The enemy had never been the cold itself. The enemy was heat in motion, leaving, and a man could stop heat from leaving, the same way her father stopped it from arriving. She drew it out that autumn on the back of a flour sack with a stub of pencil, and even drawn it looked strange. 2 walls, where one would do. A gap between them, 8 inches deep, packed solid, with dry sawdust and shavings, begged for free from the mill yard. A low ceiling, packed the same way above, with a loft beneath the rafters to shrink the room she would have to heat. The whole north face of the cabin banked against an earthen berm she and her brother would raise with a borrowed scraper, so the worst wind would strike packed soil instead of pine. A small stove, deliberately small, set near the center, and small windows on the south wall only, double-glazed with 2 panes and an inch of air between, shuttered tight at night. People who saw the drawing did not call it clever. They called it a waste of good lumber, and within a week half of Larkspur knew the young widow Hartwell meant to bury herself in sawdust before the snow flew. Hollis Webb came back twice more before she was finished, and the second time he brought an argument instead of a joke. He stood over her flour sack, drawing with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and traced the double line of the walls with a carpenter's certainty. "A wall is a wall," he said. "You make it thick, and you make it tight, and you trust good wood. You don't fill it with the sweepings off my shop floor. I've put up 40 houses in this valley, and not one of them needed a second skin to keep a family alive." Several men nodded, because Hollis was right about the 40 houses, and because what he said was the plain wisdom of the country. The trouble was that the plain wisdom of the country had not kept Samuel alive, and Della knew the precise size of that failure better than any man standing in her doorway. Not everyone laughed. Dr. Ambrose Wells, who had ridden out to half the deathbeds in the territory and was not a man given to mockery, came by on his way back from a confinement and studied the walls a long while without a word. Then he turned to Della with a frown that held no contempt, only worry. "I'll grant you it may hold the warmth," he said slowly. "But a house has to breathe, Mrs. Hartwell. Seal it up that tight. Pack those walls so the wind can't move through them, and you trap more than heat. You trap the damp off your own cooking and your own breathing. Bad air settles in a closed room. Standing wet rots timber and rots lungs along with it. I've seen children sicken in a house too tightly shut." It was the one objection that reached her, because it was offered in care and not in scorn, and because she could not yet answer it. She thanked him for it honestly. That night, she sat by a single lamp long after Sadie slept and added 2 things to the flour sack drawing. A row of small vents low along the south wall, closable with a slip of tin, and a single capped opening in the peak of the loft. A house, she decided, could be made to breathe on purpose. In a slow, controlled draw she could open and shut, instead of breathing helplessly through every crack the way Samuel's cabin had. The doctor's fear was real. Ignoring it would have been easier than building around it. She built around it. The work that followed pulled in everyone she had. Her brother Jonah, 15 and raw-boned and quiet, drove the sawmill road every dawn with a borrowed cart and came back heaped with shavings, 10 and 12 loads before the snow, until the millman took to leaving a pile sacked and ready by the gate just to be rid of him. Della worked the walls herself, board by board, packing each cavity tight and capping it before she moved to the next. Sadie carried what a 5-year-old could carry, fistfuls of dry shavings in her apron, walking them solemnly across the lot as if the whole house depended on her armload, and in a way that Della never said aloud, it did. A neighbor woman named Ruth Callie, widowed herself and unafraid of being seen with the town's favorite fool, came 3 afternoons a week and worked the berm with the scraper while Jonah drove the mule. By the time the aspens had dropped their last gold leaf, Della had used near 4,000 board feet of pine on a cabin a smaller one would have built with half that, packed better than 2 tons of mill waste into her walls and ceiling, and banked 3 feet of earth against her whole north face. The pile of finished cabin looked less like a frontier home and more like a low fortress dug into the slope, and even the men who had laughed loudest grew quiet driving past it. because whatever the widow Hartwell was building, it had stopped being a notion and become a thing with weight and mass that sat there refusing to be a joke. The reckoning came not from Hollis Webb but from Otis Dunbar, who ran the lumber yard and the supply counter and kept the only ledger in Larkspur that mattered to a person with no man and no money. He brought the last of her glass himself, a wagon load of double-paned sash she had ordered up from the railhead, and he unloaded it slow and stood watching her seal a wall seam with tar paper and lath. For a while he said nothing. Then he looked at the size of the house and the size of what she had bought to make it. "That's a lot of account standing on one idea, Della," he said. There was no anger in it. "More than folks know. I've carried you because your father was a friend to mine and because a body ought to have a roof. But I'll be straight with you, the way he'd want me to be. If this works, none of it matters, and I'm glad to have helped." He stopped and made himself finish it. "If it doesn't, there's not enough left on your name to buy the lumber for a plain cabin before the freeze. You'd winter in Samuel's old place again, with Sadie." The words hung in the cold yard, and this time nobody laughed because there was no crowd and no joke left in it. The whole bet had been laid out plain on the counter of the supply store, and the stakes were not a man's pride. They were a child's second winter. Della pressed the last strip of paper flat with the edge of her thumb and kept her hand steady because it would not do to let it shake. Across the lot, Jonah had heard every word, and he watched his sister's back and understood for the first time that she was not merely doing something odd. She was wagering everything they had on a thing her father had only ever done with ice, and the winter itself would settle whether she had been wise or only desperate. She lit the stove for the first true test on a gray afternoon in late November, with a curl of townsfolk loitering at the road to see the widow's house either save her or shame her. She built the fire small and hot the way she meant to build it all winter, a quick, fierce blaze of split pine and pitch that threw heat fast, and she shut the windows and the vents and waited. For an hour, the cabin warmed beautifully. The lower half of the room grew snug, then nearly hot, and Della let herself believe. Then Sadie, sitting up in the loft where she'd been sent to play, said her hands were cold, and Della climbed the ladder and felt it at once. The air near the floor was warm as a kitchen. The air at the top of the room, up in the loft against the peak, was cold as the yard. She pressed her palm to the upper wall, and her stomach dropped. The board was chill straight through. Somewhere in the cavity behind it, there was no sawdust at all. She had built the walls true and packed them tight, but she had not reckoned on what loose dust does over weeks of a wagon road's worth of rumble and the settling of green lumber drying. The sawdust had slumped. All down the height of every wall, it had slowly compacted and sunk toward the floor, packing hard at the bottom and pulling away from the top, until the upper third of the house stood walled in nothing but two thin boards and a gap of empty air. The cold came pouring in across the loft and rolled down on the warmth like water finding its level, and no fire she could build would ever fill a room that leaked out its whole top edge. The onlookers saw it on her face before she said a word. Hollis Webb, leaning on the road fence, did not look pleased, only tired and certain, and what he said was quiet enough that it carried worse than a shout. "There it is," he said. "Wood does what wood does. You can't pack a wall with dust and expect it to stay where you put it." And Dr. Wells, stepping in at the doorway, ran a finger along the cold upper boards and showed Della the beads of wet standing where the warm air met the chill, the damp he had warned her of, gathering exactly as he'd said it would. For the first time since she had raised her pencil, Della had no answer. She never once thought of tearing it down. The dust had told her something, and that was all. For 3 nights, the cabin burned its lamp long after every other window in Larkspur had gone dark, and Della worked the walls one cavity at a time, while Jonah held the light, and Sadie slept wrapped warm in the part of the house that still held heat. The fix, when it came to her on the second night, was so plain she nearly laughed. The dust slumped because nothing held it up, so she would give it shelves to rest on. She pried the inner boards and nailed thin cross battens horizontally inside every cavity, a ledge every 2 feet up the whole height of the wall, so the sawdust packed into each section sat on its own little floor and could not slide past it to the bottom. Then she filled every cavity again, tier by tier, topping each one full and capping it before she climbed to the next. Against the inner face of it all, on the warm side where the doctor's damp had stood, She pasted a skin of tar paper and a wash of lime to turn back the moisture before it could ever creep into the dust and rot the wood. And she finished what the doctor had truly come to fear by opening her vents properly at last. A slim row low on the south wall, and the single capped draw at the peak, so the house could pull a thin, steady breath of fresh air through itself, dry and slow, carrying off the wet of cooking and sleeping without ever bleeding out the heat. A house, she had decided, would breathe the way she chose, and not the way the wind chose for it. She lit the second fire on a still cold evening with no crowd at all, only Jonah and Sadie and Ruth Callie, who had refused to miss it. The small blaze caught. The warmth built. And this time, when Della climbed the ladder and laid her hand to the upper wall, and then to the peak of the loft, the boards were warm. Not warm with the last gasp of a fire about to die, but warm clear through, holding the whole room from floor to rafter, wrapped in one even blanket of heat that did not pour out the top because there was no longer a hole at the top for it to pour through. The air stayed dry. The lime-washed walls stood clean. She sat down on the loft floor in the quiet and did not say anything for a long time, and Sadie crawled into her lap, warm all the way to her cold-prone little feet, and that was the only proof Della had wanted in the first place. By December, the people of Larkspur had begun to notice that the widow's chimney behaved wrong. A cabin in that country, on a cold morning, ought to stream smoke all day long, a steady banner that meant a family was feeding a fire against the cold, the only way anyone knew how. The Hartwell place did no such thing. Della lit one small, fast fire just after dawn, drove it hot for an hour with pine and pitch and shavings, and then let it die down to ash, and for the rest of the day her chimney stood as quiet and cold as if no one lived there. Yet smoke or no smoke, no frost ever crept up the inside of her windows the way it had silvered Samuel's glass every night. And Jonah, who measured everything, noticed the thing that mattered most. The woodpile was not shrinking. It was the middle of December, and it stood nearly as tall as the day they had stacked it, while every other rick in town was already half gone. Della made little of it. One evening she stepped out, read the thermometer Otis had sold her, marked a single number in pencil on the doorframe, and went back inside without a word. The number stayed there. Nobody outside the house knew what it meant, and Della saw no reason to explain a thing the winter would explain for her soon enough. January came in under a sky the color of cold iron, and the jokes had mostly died by then because people were too busy laying in for the heart of the winter to spend their breath on the widow Hartwell. It was Hollis Webb who first said out loud what the old men had been muttering. He rode out past her place one still afternoon and reined in, and there was no amusement left in his face. "Geese went south 3 weeks early," he said, to no one in particular, and to Della in particular. "Cattle on the Pruitt Range have stood with their tails to the north all week and won't graze. And the glass on my wall has been falling faster than I've seen it fall in 20 years. He looked north, toward the flats, the way a man looks at something coming. The trappers down from the high country were saying the air had the same dead weight it had carried before the killing winter 2 years back, the one that had stacked frozen cattle against the drift fences by the hundred and emptied half the hay in the territory before March. Men who lived their lives out of doors did not ignore signs like those. "It's coming, ma'am," Hollis said at last, and there was no challenge left in it, only the flat honesty of one neighbor warning another. "Whatever you've built, you'd best hope it's built right." Then he turned his horse for home. Della watched him go and carried one more armful of split pine inside and set it by the stove with the rest. There was nothing left to do. The house was finished. All that remained was to find out whether her father's ice had taught her the truth. The storm came down on a Thursday and did not let up for 6 days. The wind arrived first, out of the north and full of teeth, and behind it came the cold, a cold that drove down past anything a thermometer in that country was meant to measure. It struck the cabins and the barns and the empty cattle pens all at once, and it did not slacken. In Hollis Webb's house, 2 streets over, the big stove that had warmed his family for 20 years worked exactly as it always had, roaring hot, eating a fresh log every half hour around the clock, and still the warmth would not hold. Near the stove a man's face baked. 6 feet away the air turned and the cold lived in the corners and slid along the floor, because every time that good strong fire pulled its draft up the chimney, it sucked an equal breath of frozen air in through the seams of the boards, an endless invisible river of cold pouring in to replace the warmth pouring out. Hollis fed the fire and fed it and could not get ahead of it. And near midnight, on the second night, he found his youngest asleep in his coat and hat, and a wave of something that was not quite fear and not quite shame moved through him. The stove was doing everything he had ever asked a stove to do. The fire was strong. The draft was clean. Nothing was broken. And still, the house demanded more wood with every hour that passed. And for the first time in his life, Hollis Webb sat by a roaring fire and asked himself, if the flames are doing their work, then where in God's name is all the heat going? 2 streets over, the Hartwell cabin kept a different kind of time. Della lit her one small fire at dawn and let it die by mid-morning, and the house simply stayed warm. The earth banked against the north wall turned the worst of the wind. The sawdust packed 8 inches deep in every wall, and over the ceiling held the dawn fire's heat the way her father's mill dust had held the winter cold away from his summer ice, and the warmth her stove made had nowhere to leak away to. Through the dead heart of the storm, the room held even and dry and snug while the wind screamed against the boards a hand's width away. Miriam, no. While the wind screamed against the boards a hand's width away, Sadie lay on a folded quilt on the warm floor, with a picture book open in front of her, breathing easy, not a trace of the cough that had nearly taken her the winter before. Jonah whittled a bridle peg by the south window. Ruth Callie, who had brought her own bedding over rather than ride out a storm of that size alone, kneaded bread dough that rose sweet in the steady warmth, and joked that she might never go home. Nobody in the Hartwell house slept in a coat. Nobody fed a fire in the dark. And Della, sitting against the warm inner wall listening to the storm try and fail to get in, did not feel triumph, only a slow, steady watchfulness, because 3 quiet days proved little against a winter that had killed before, and the real question was whether the house would still be holding its warmth when the worst of it came. By the 4th day, the storm had stopped being about temperature and started being about fuel, and that was where Larkspur began to break. Wood ricks that had looked generous in November stood gutted. A well on the east end froze to the rock, and a family hauled snow indoors to melt for water in a kettle that never got ahead of their thirst. A man near the creek pried the rails off his own fence and burned them. By the 5th day, the fences were going up all over town, rail by rail, and then a barn door, and a settler's good oak table, and anything else that would take a flame, while the cold sat on the settlement like a hand pressing down. Otis Dunbar broke into a reserve shed he had sworn to hold until February and sold cordwood at a price that shamed him, and even then a man could only buy 3 days of it, 4 if he let his house go cold at night. People stopped asking each other how cold it was. They started asking how much wood was left, and a quarter cord became the most precious thing a family owned. And out past the north edge of town, under the snow, the Hartwell woodpile stood very nearly as tall as it had in December, because a house that does not let its heat leave does not need much to make. Della went out on the 5th evening to gather the small armful her morning fire required, and she stopped in the blue dusk and looked at the great untouched stack of it, and she did not need any more proof than that. Her father's secret was not keeping them comfortable. It was keeping them alive while the town around them burned its furniture to stay one night ahead of the cold. On the 6th day, the wind broke. It went out of the world a little at a time, the way it had come, until the snow lay still on the flats and the smoke from the surviving chimneys rose straight up into a sky gone hard and clear and pale. Larkspur came out of its houses looking like a place that had survived a siege. The fence lines that had once run square across the prairie ended now in ragged gaps. Wood ricks stood scattered down to scraps and bark. More than one family had burned what they swore they never would, and a few head of stock had not made it through in the open. The storm had taken its payment in full. Hollis Webb stood on his own porch in the new stillness with ice in his beard and his eyes gone old from a week of broken nights, and he looked at the splintered remains of his own woodpile, and then he looked north, toward the low cabin dug into the slope at the edge of town, and a thing turned over in him that he had been holding off for 3 months. Curiosity had drawn him to the widow's place in the fall. Then had come the certainty that she was a fool. Then the criticism, and the warning, and the long cold week of feeding a fire that could not win. What he felt now was none of those. It was a question, and it would not let him be. He pulled on his coat and started walking. The snow squeaked under his boots as he crossed the broken town, and everywhere he passed he saw the storm's verdict written plain. The empty wood racks and the gnawed-down fences and the smoke of fires that had cost their families dear. By the time the Hartwell cabin came in sight, he had stopped rehearsing arguments. He was not walking out there to defend his 40 houses, or to laugh, or to be proven right. The winter had already settled all of that. He was walking out there because he needed to understand what he had seen, and a man who has spent his life building shelter against the cold cannot rest with a thing he does not understand. He came up the bank and stood before the low door a moment, gathering himself, and then he knocked. The door opened, and the warmth rolled out over him, and it was not the sharp blast that comes off a roaring stove right beside the door. This was something else. Dry, even, settled. The kind of warmth that fills a whole room and stays in it. Hollis stepped inside, and the first thing his eyes went to was the stove, and the stove was cold. The iron was dark. No fire moved behind the door. It had been out for hours. He could see that plainly, and yet the cabin around him was warm as a spring afternoon. He looked slowly around the room. Sadie sat on the warm floor with her book, pink-cheeked and easy, looking for all the world as though there were no blizzard's wreckage steaming in the sun outside the door. Jonah sat whittling. Ruth Callie's bread cooled on a board. Nobody was fighting the cold. Nobody was feeding a fire. The whole scene was so ordinary that it stopped Hollis Webb where he stood, because he knew exactly how impossible, ordinary, should have been. Della watched him without a word. She had no speech ready and no apology to collect. The house had already said everything she might have. After a long moment, she nodded toward the wall. "Go on," she said. Hollis pulled off his glove and laid his bare hand flat against the inner boards. The wall was warm, not faintly, not the dying warmth of a spent fire. Warm enough that he left his hand there longer than he meant to. But Hollis had not built 40 houses by believing the first easy thing, and a warm board proved little by itself, so he went to work the way he would inspect any house in the valley. Della had built a small hinged hatch low in one wall, a way to reach the cavity and check the packing, and Hollis opened it and crouched and looked, and there it was, the dust still standing full and dry on its little battens, packed firm to the very top with no slump and no gap and no wet, 8 solid inches of trapped air between the family and the killing cold. He moved to the next wall, and the next. The story was the same everywhere. He stood by the south window and felt the slow thread of fresh air sliding in through the vent, dry and clean, with not a breath of the heavy closed-up damp the doctor had feared. While he worked, the door opened again and Otis Dunbar stepped in, having come to see for himself, and his eyes went straight to the woodpile stacked along the wall and stayed there, and the ledger he carried in his head suddenly seemed a very small thing beside what he was looking at. A while later, Dr. Ambrose Wells came in stamping snow, and unlike the others, he barely glanced at the walls. He looked at Sadie, breathing slow and clean on the warm floor with her book, the cough that had nearly killed her last winter nowhere in the room, and the doctor's shoulders came down from around his ears, because that child, healthy in a sealed warm house through the worst storm in years, answered the only question he had ever asked. Hollis had seen enough. The truth of it, when he had it, was far plainer than every rumor that had run through Larkspur in the fall. Della Hartwell had not packed her walls with magic, and she had not been lucky. She had understood a thing the rest of them had never thought to ask. Heat always tries to move from where it is warm to where it is cold. Always, the way water runs downhill, and a thin board wall barely slows it at all. So the warmth a stove made in an ordinary cabin went straight out through the boards and the seams nearly as fast as the fire could make it, and the family froze beside a good fire, because the fire could never fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. What Della had built was a wall the heat could not easily cross. All those inches of dry sawdust, full of still trapped air, were a blanket the warmth could not get through, so the heat her small morning fire made simply stayed in the house instead of pouring out of it. It was the very thing her father had done to keep summer's heat away from his ice, only turned around to keep winter's cold away from her child. She had not fought the cold at all. She had only refused, stubbornly and cleverly, to let the warmth leave. Hollis stood by the cold stove and the warm wall, and turned it over in his mind, and he understood at last that the widow's house was not a trick played against nature. It was a deeper obedience to nature than anything he had built in 40 years. He stood a long while before he spoke. "I've spent my whole life," he said finally, and his voice was rough, trying to build a fire big enough to beat the cold. His eyes went to the dark stove and the warm walls around it. You spent yours figuring out how to keep the worm from getting away." Nobody hurried to answer him. The words carried their own weight, and Della did not treat it as a victory. There was no triumph in her face, no satisfaction at old jeers paid back, no interest at all in the apologies the winter had already collected on her behalf. She had a child who was warm and alive, and beside that, being proven right meant very little to her. In the weeks that followed, neighbors came with money and asked her to sell them the plan, and a man rode in from a settlement 2 valleys over to ask whether she would build the same for them. Della declined the money every time. She did not open a shop or guard a secret or turn her father's old trade into a business. When someone asked how the house worked, she pulled out the same flour sack with the same penciled drawing that had made the whole town laugh in October, and she showed them the 2 walls and the gap and the dust and the little battens to hold it, and then she handed it over and went back to whatever needed doing. Dr. Wells took to telling people that good sense rarely shows up wearing a sign that says so, and that a man could learn more from a young widow with a flour sack than from all his years of being certain. Otis Dunbar stopped throwing mill waste into the burn pile and started sacking it for whoever wanted it. And the most surprising change of all belonged to Hollis Webb. The first house he rebuilt with 2 walls and a packed cavity and a wall that finally held its heat was his own. By the following autumn, low-banked cabins with double walls had begun to appear all across the country around Larkspur. Some copied from Della's flour sack, almost board for board, others borrowing only the idea of it and bending it to a different floor plan, and the old men allowed that there had been folk in the old countries, in Norway and farther east, who had built thick double walls and banked their homes with sod and snow against the cold for longer than anyone could remember, so that the widow had not so much invented a thing as remembered one the new country had been in too much of a hurry to learn. Through all of it, Della's days stayed much the same. Each morning she lit one small hot fire and let it die, and the walls held the warmth, and the rest of the day belonged to a house that did not need her standing over a stove. Sadie grew up strong in that house and never coughed her way through another February. People in Larkspur remembered the winter of 1888 for a long time after, and when they spoke of it, they did not speak first of the storm or the fences they had burned, or even of the stock they had lost. They spoke of the young widow on the north edge of town who had been laughed at in the fall, and whose house was the only warm one when the cold came down to kill. The men who had mocked her had not been stupid. They had only trusted what they already knew, the way most people do, and they had learned the hard way that the cold does not care in the least what a man is used to. Reputation buys nothing from a winter like that one. Experience earns no mercy. When the air falls cold enough, it puts the same plain question to every house, and every habit, and every certainty a person owns, and it does not accept a clever answer, only a true one. It asks what holds. And in Larkspur, long after Della's morning fire had burned down to gray ash, her walls were still holding the warmth, and the answer to that question stayed warm inside them all the way to spring. Sometimes the wisdom that saves us was handed down years ago by someone who loved us, waiting quietly until we need it. Della didn't beat the cold. She simply refused to let warmth leave, and maybe that's the gentlest truth of all. Hold close the people and small kindnesses that warm you, and keep that warmth where it belongs, at home, with the ones who need it most.